So let me just start with kind of motivation, basically, where I'm coming from. So generally in my kind of research, I'm interested, on the one hand, I'm interested a lot in image processing and in computer vision. And of course, there are lots of other people that are interested in this field. So they're both, it's a huge field, basically. There are many different tasks in image processing applications, computer vision applications, and kind of as a consequence of that, there are also many solutions. And quite often, solutions are quite specific to a particular problem or to a particular application. So many of them are bespoke techniques. On the other hand, I'm also quite interested in artificial intelligence, quite interested in soft computing techniques in particular. And one of the kind of sub areas there, I'm quite interested in optimization algorithms. And that's also what you kind of can guess from the title of my talk. So we're talking about trying to use metaheuristics optimization techniques for some image processing task, for some image processing applications. And again, when we're looking at computation optimization, a lot of work has basically been done. It's also a huge field, basically, and a lot of optimization techniques, a lot of metaheuristics have been introduced in the literature, and they've also been shown to work quite well, basically, for a variety of optimization problems. So I will try to basically kind of bridge the gap between them and show that we can use metaheuristic optimization techniques for some image processing applications. And one of the kind of advantages that we've got with these kind of generic optimization techniques, metaheuristic optimization techniques, is that they are essentially, they're not specific. So we need to define what we're after. And if we can do that, then we can essentially use one of those algorithms. And that makes it quite convenient. So in terms of how we'll proceed, so I've just given you the motivation, I will essentially use one kind of main example of an image processing technique. Here I'm using color quantization. It's something that actually I've been working on for quite a long time. I think it probably goes back to probably 15 years or more. We've like on and off been working on various techniques for color quantization. And that also makes a really nice example where I can then show you that we can use optimization techniques, that we can use metaheuristics for actually tackling that problem. And while there are lots and lots of nowadays metaheuristics out there, the kind of most commonly known ones are probably like genetic algorithms, particle swarm optimization, and so on. So in my talk, I will actually focus on techniques that we've used over the years. And those are actually also techniques that have been developed by co-researchers, so by some of my colleagues. And then we use them for some applications, including the ones that I will actually show you. And then towards the end, I will also show you briefly another example, the various different applications, image processing applications for which we can use metaheuristics. As I mentioned, I will mainly be looking at color quantization, and then towards the end, I will briefly also mention another one, related one in a sense, which is multi-level thresholding. And while I could be talking about lots of other things as well, I understand that my time is limited to half an hour. So I will try to finish within that time frame. So let me start then with color quantization. So here the problem that we're trying to tackle in a sense is, so we've got color images. And we know that color images, so we've got 3 color channels, red, green, and blue. And in most instances, the colors are recorded with 8-bit precision. So we've got 8 bits for red, 8 for green, 8 for blue. So we've got 256 values for each of the color channels. We're ending up with 24-bit images. And that means that we've got a possible color gamut, so all possible colors that we can create, of, well, more than 16 million, basically 16.8 million or so, which is obviously quite big. Now, typically, images won't use all of these. And also, on the other hand, we can't actually distinguish so many different colors. So we can distinguish something like 1,000 colors or so, roughly. And then, of course, that's kind of more historic in a sense. There were, at some point, there were also, hardware that could also limit, but they're limited basically in terms of how many colors you could actually simultaneously display. Nowadays, that problem is not so big anymore. It's still there to a certain extent for mobile devices, but the task that we're after here in terms of color quantization is that instead of having 16.8 million colors, we are reducing the number of colors that we can show to a small subset. And with small here, I mean something like 16 colors, maybe 64 colors, maybe 256 colors. The examples that I'm showing you is actually reducing all those colors down to only 16 colors. And then what we can do is we can then show that image using only those 16 colors. So those 16 colors actually make up what we call a code book or a color palette. And then basically each pixel in the image points to one of the colors in the color palette. And that kind of arrangement is also useful for not just what I mentioned before on the hardware side, but it's naturally already a compression technique. It's useful. We've published a couple of papers that can also be useful for things like image retrieval. It's being used for things like video conferencing, for example. So something that we're doing right now. And also there are a couple of other applications where it can be used as a kind of a pre-processing step, maybe for segmentation, maybe for some other stuff and so on. So let me just show you an example. Of course, that the task is now we try to find those, let's say, 16 colors based on an image that we are given. Now, logically, it depends now on which 16 colors do we actually choose and how do we choose them. And from that will basically determine the resulting image quality that we come up with. So what you see here is, you've got examples on the left-hand side. You see a nice image of like a teapot and some billiard poles and so on. So that's the original image, the true color image. And then you see two examples of, two differently quantized images. Each of those two images have got just 16 colors. And you can see that the one in the middle doesn't look very nice because here we've mainly chosen, green and gray shades basically. And therefore we can't, very well represent the image that we've got. Whereas the one on the right-hand side is one that chooses, quite appropriate 16 colors. And of course, there are some differences to the original image, but they are, fairly acceptable. And actually the one on the right-hand side, that's one of, was generated by one of our algorithms. So finding the right colors is crucial. Now, how to do that? That's problematic because one can actually show that it's an NP-complete problem. So we would essentially, to find the optimal solution, we would need to find out all possible combinations. So that's not really feasible. We can't do that within a feasible amount of time. And therefore, we need to arrive at different approaches. Now, kind of literature, so color quantization actually has got a fairly large literature. Some of the kind of most commonly approaches and also the kind of approaches that we compare our stuff to include what I list down here. So one very simple technique would be just taking the most common colors. You can already imagine that might not be the best solution. And in fact, the one here in the middle, that's actually what you get if you do that. And then the other techniques that essentially look at how the colors are kind of distributed in the color space, and kind of splitting the color space or into almost like two parts, and then again and again and again. So that's median cut quantization basically comes in. That's also similar to octree quantization, where essentially the colors are kind of modeled in an octree structure. And then just another one, the list here is neoquant. So here a self-organizing map, a cohonent map, is basically the type of neural network is basically being used to actually derive the palette. So we'll be looking at a different approach. We'll be looking at trying to use metaheuristics. So metaheuristics, so if you haven't come across them before, they're essentially, kind of higher level optimization algorithms. And again, it's based on the idea that we can't try out everything that we have got. We need to, essentially inspect, we can only inspect like a subset of the possible solutions. And metaheuristics try to do that, in a sense, in a clever way. So trying to cut down the time that it takes for the search. And we have got kind of two comments, and they kind of compete against each other. So we've got our all possible solutions that basically define the search space. So on the one hand, we need to be able to explore the search space sufficiently. And the idea here is that we try to identify some areas where we're looking at, so if we're looking at trying to find like an error, which is also what we'll be doing for color quantization later. So trying to find like the minimum error, so the minimum minimum in the search space. And then on the other hand, we try to get a really, really good solution. Not necessarily the best one that exists, but one that's really good. And that means once we have identified some promising areas, we need to exploit those. And that's the concept of exploitation. So trying to find the best or near best solution in one of those promising areas. As I mentioned before, there's been lots of metaheuristics that have been proposed. So you probably heard about genetic algorithms, particle swarm optimization, ant colony optimization, and other techniques. As I mentioned, I will be introducing some other ones here. And one motivation of that is also there is this what is called the no free lunch theorem. And basically it says that there is no single metaheuristic optimization technique that works best for all possible problems. So even if you've got developed something that works really well and that has been shown to work well for a number of problems, there's still it still makes sense to basically look both for other metaheuristics as well. So now, how can we use metaheuristics for color quantization? So one of the nice advantages of metaheuristics is that they are essentially a kind of black box algorithm. So we can use them for a variety of problems. And essentially what we have to do is we have to define what we call an objective function or a fitness function. And that's something that we often have to do anyway for any kind of problem. And that fitness function or objective function, essentially tells us for a particular solution how well that solution works for the problem that we've got. So as long as we can actually define something like that, we can, in principle, use a metaheuristic for trying to solve that optimization problem. Now, when we're looking at color quantization, so what I'm after in terms of color quantizations, I'm trying to find the best colors, the best subset of colors, let's say 16 colors, for an existing image. And what I'm trying to achieve is that if I use those 16 colors, I should get an image that's as close as possible to the original image. So as close as possible, we can quantify. So we can basically calculate the difference from the original image to the quantized image. And that's what we've got here. So we can do that on a pixel basis. So that's what we've got here in this part here of the equation. That's basically calculating the error of the image. And we can try to be a little bit more clever. We can also, the other part we've got here, so that P here is a penalty function that just essentially makes sure that we're not getting colors that where no pixels are assigned to those colors. So one other way, and I didn't mention it before, of actually thinking about color quantization. So color quantization can also be seen as a clustering problem. So we've got a set of samples, and we're trying to basically cluster those in a set of clusters, and those clusters correspond to the colors in the color palette. So here, that penalty function part, the second part, that P part here, would essentially ensure that we're not ending up with empty clusters. Right. This stuff down here, please ignore that. Actually should have been on a different slide because I haven't actually talked about the first technique that we're using. So the first one, so here we're actually using something that's been around for quite some time. It's an algorithm that's based on simulated annealing. So simulated annealing is a fairly commonly known optimization technique that simulates, well, that's where the name comes from, the annealing of a metal. So we've got a metal that's heated up basically near to the melting point, and then we're slowly cooling that down. And that allows the particles in the metal basically to move towards a kind of a minimum energy state. And it also gives us some control basically about the microstructure. And simulated annealing essentially is a computing technique that tries to simulate that annealing process. In principle, it's a kind of a variant of hill climbing. So hill climbing, one of the most commonly used techniques. So we're starting from some random point. So that idea of using, randomness is quite common basically for metaheuristics. We've got our search space. So on each point in the search space, we can calculate the fitness. So around our current solution, so we're basically looking around that and try to find, new trial solutions within a neighborhood. And then we're trying to move basically towards one that is better than the current one. Unlike hill climbing, however, we're not always moving towards the better solution, but we're essentially moving towards the better solution with a certain probability. And that probability is related to a temperature. So that's kind of related to the annealing process again. The temperature is being used there. And we can essentially use that temperature to, in a sense, steer that optimization problem. And it also means that, as we move along, basically, we change the probability with which we are moving towards new solution. And that, again, that helps us basically in terms of the exploitation stage of the algorithm. So then look a little bit more closely how we're actually looking at a new candidate solution within the current neighborhood. So here we've basically got an interval basically for each of the components. We're kind of, plus minus a certain number that we're looking at. And that interval is defined by what we call a step width. And actually that step width needs to be chosen quite carefully. And that makes using simulated annealing potentially quite tricky. Because if the step width essentially is too small, then we're risking getting stuck in a local optimum, so not being able to jump out of a local optimum and trying to find the global one or a better local optimum. On the other hand, if that step width is too large, then we might not actually reach that minimum or that maximum that we're after. So therefore, what we're doing is we're not using the kind of standard version of simulated annealing, but we're using what is called step width adapting simulated annealing. So that's a technique that was developed by Lars Nolle, a previous colleague of mine. And here we essentially are adaptively adjusting that step width. And the step width essentially is or becomes a function of the current iteration of the algorithm. And that essentially leads to a version of simulated annealing that first performs mainly exploration, and then it's focusing more and more on that kind of hill climbing part to perform the exploitation stage in a better version compared to standard simulated annealing. So the step width basically gets reduced as we move along during the algorithm. So how does that work for color quantization? I've mentioned before, again, we need to define a fitness function or an objective function. I've actually shown you that before, so I've already discussed that before. One other kind of variation that we're using here is that we actually were using a population-based version of SWASA, of simulated annealing. That means we're running several solutions concurrently, and we can then essentially pick the, the best one. And again, that helps us essentially avoiding local optima and giving us a better chance to find the global optimum. That's not actually where the parameters should be. I won't be going into the details. Obviously, each algorithm that we're looking at has got some parameters. And typically, we need to do a little bit, at least, of trial and error to find proper values for those. So let me just show you how that generally works for color quantization then. So here we see the images that we're using here. So they are very popular images that are kind of being used in almost every color quantization paper. And the measure that we're using here to see how well things work is peak signal to noise ratio. So that's a standard measure that we're using for calculating the difference between two images. Peak signal to noise ratio is also essentially, it's being derived from the mean squared error. And the mean squared error is basically what we're optimizing using our techniques here. So what I'm showing you here then is, how well things work. So we've got 6 images, and we compare it to those other algorithms that we've mentioned before. And then in the last column that was got here, so that's what we're using our simulated annealing version for. Here you can see confirmed what I mentioned before. Popularity algorithm doesn't work very well. It's very simple, but it's really too simple. The other ones work much better. But what we're seeing here, so these are dedicated algorithms for color quantization. Here we see that even though simulated annealing is a generic metaheuristic technique, we actually can get significantly better. So 1 dB in terms of peak signal to noise ratio is relatively significant. So here we can get better results by using simulated annealing. And just to show you a couple of images. So here we see again that image that I've shown you before. So that's the original true color image. And here you see the quantization results from the different algorithms. Again, you see popularity doesn't work at all. Median cut, octree work reasonably well. NeoQuant, for this particular example, you see it doesn't actually catch the red properly. So it doesn't actually have a proper red color in the palette. And then we see that the best result that we're getting is by using our simulated annealing approach. So with these things, Metaheuristic makes sense to use here. We get really good results. That's actually something that we've done quite some time ago, so more than 10 years ago. And recently, we have looked again at that issue, and we've looked at essentially more recent techniques. And again, more recent techniques that were developed by some of my colleagues. And the next 2 things that I'm showing you are actually things that we've just published early this year. So we had a couple of papers at Gecko, so the kind of main conference for genetic algorithms and those kind of things. And one was on using a technique that's called SOMA. So that stands for self-organizing migration algorithm. So that's a technique that's developed by Ivan Selinka from the Czech Republic and his colleagues. Actually a technique that has been around for quite some time, but fairly recently, like last year or so, they introduced some, again, fairly simple modifications, and modifications that actually led to a significant improvement in terms of the performance of the algorithm. So that version of SOMA is called SOMA Team-to-Team Adaptive, or T3A, so SOMA T3A. And that's we've basically see, how well does that work for our problem of color quantization. The main idea between that SOMA algorithm is that, so we've got solutions called individuals, and we basically split them into leaders and migrants. So leaders are kind of the ones where we've got the best solutions, and then we're trying to steer the migrants towards the leaders. And then we're trying to basically improve the overall performance of that whole population. So how that works is we've got different phases. Basically, we've got an organization phase. That whole thing works iteratively. So within each iteration, we are dividing the current population, or we are extracting 2 subpopulations from our current population. So SOMA is a population-based metaheuristic. And in contrast to that kind of population-based version of simulated annealing that I mentioned before, so that one for simulated annealing, we just had a certain number of individuals, and they basically worked independently of each other. So here in SOMA, and also in the next technique, here they actually cooperate and they share information. And that gives us typically a gain in terms of performance. So population-based metaheuristic algorithms typically work better than those that are based on a single solution. So what we've got here is here we extract 2 subpopulations of particular sizes. From one of them, we are then selecting or identifying the best one, so the one with the highest fitness. We designate it as the leader. And then from the other population, we select the best ones there, and we designate them as the migrants. So then what we're doing is, so this kind of illustrates that we've got a population, we are selecting a subset, we get one leader of that, and then we select another subset. There might be an overlap between them, and we're selecting a number of migrants from there. What we're then doing in the next phase, so that's the migration phase. So here now we're making the migrants move towards the leader. And I think I don't have enough time to really go into the details here. So again, that's done in a clever way that allows us to basically focus both on exploration and on exploitation. And we've got some parameters basically. Again, there's like a step width basically in there, which are adaptively selected. So sounds a little bit like the previous technique, the simulated annealing that I mentioned. And then we've got an update phase where if we found for individual a better solution, then we're replacing that better, that individual with that better solution. And again, that works iteratively. And as we are moving through the iterations, we should get a population that's better and better. And then we're selecting the best one out of the final population as the solution to our problem. So again, what we need to do is we need to select the fitness function. So this here is written in a different way to the previous one, but it's doing something very, very similar. So here basically we're selecting just the mean squared error between the original image and the quantized image. And again, of course, we need to select a couple of parameters for the algorithm. And now I can show you how that works. Again, I'm showing you results here based on the same images, so the same 6 images that we've got. I'm showing you again the other 4 techniques that I've mentioned before. I'm showing you the results here of SPARSA, so the step with adapting simulated annealing that I've discussed before. And here also I'm showing the results of a couple of clustering techniques. So FCM fuzzy C-means, rough C-means, fuzzy rough C-means, because we've also looked at some point into using those. And those actually work because I've mentioned before, color quantization can be seen as a clustering problem, and well-working clustering algorithms, it makes sense to use those, and they also give quite nice results. The last one that you will see here then is SOMA. So we can see that we actually get here a technique that is able to essentially outperform all the other ones, or at least in most cases. And that includes not just the kind of dedicated color quantization techniques, that includes also that version of simulated annealing that I've mentioned before. And part of the reason of that is because here we're now using a true population-based metaheuristics that actually shares information between the individuals, and we can also see it actually outperforms those clustering techniques as well, which is also quite a nice result. I can show you one image as an example. So here, this one here is the original image, and then there's not enough space basically for all the techniques. So I show you median cut, octree. I'm showing you that simulated annealing. I'm showing you the best performing clustering technique, or one of the best performing clustering techniques, so fuzzy C-means, and then I'm showing you SOMA. And then I'm not just showing you, because it's often, especially with small versions of the images, quite hard to see the differences. So I'm also showing you for each image, for each quantized image, a difference image to the original one. And here, the more black things basically are, the more different the quantized image is to the original image. So particularly from the difference images, we can see that the SOMA one is, the one that shows the least differences compared to the other ones. So the one that gives us the best results, which is quite nice. Right, I've got one more technique, and I think I need to rush through that because I haven't got enough time. So human method search is an even more recent technique developed by mainly by Gerald. He works at the university in Iran, and that's essentially a technique that he developed for his PhD. And we then looked how that can be used for a couple of image processing applications. So here we are essentially interested in trying to, it's kind of trying to model bits, like a search space of bits for something like online auctions. So here each candidate solution is called a bit. Initially we select them randomly. That's the same, in many techniques. Again, we need a fitness function. And then again, we've got 3 phases here. We've got one phase, which is called the mental search. So that searches the kind of neighborhood of a current bit. And here we're doing that using a level flight distribution. So essentially something that allows us again to focus both on exploration and on exploitation. So we're getting kind of a distribution where we've got, a couple of small steps followed by a large step. So we can have the ability to jump out of local optima. So then after that mental search, we've got a grouping operator. So here we are essentially clustering the population. into a couple of groups, and then we're evaluating each group. And we're evaluating each group basically by the average fitness of that group. And that is being used to identify a promising area in search space, because we're picking the one that gives us the highest average fitness. And then we're moving candidate solution towards that area, and specifically we're moving it towards the best solution in that winning cluster. Again, it's very high level, obviously, but I've got here, there's a little bit more to that, but I think it should be sufficient here. Now, how can we use it for color quantization? Well, we can use that in exactly the same fashion as we've done before. So this slide is virtually the same as I have shown you before. And I can again verify what we're getting in terms of the results. Again, the same 6 images. Again, the same algorithms that I did before, the dedicated color quantization techniques. Again, simulated annealing. Here we've got even more different versions basically of fuzzy c-means, so different clustering techniques. And then we've got human mental search, and quite nicely we see again that it outperforms the other techniques. And we can also look at that in terms of the same image that I've shown you before. And again, we see here that we're getting, the kind of nicest error image, meaning the highest image quality, meaning, the image being the closest to the original out of all these various techniques. I don't think I've got time for that really, because I'm already like more than half an hour. But so color quantization is really just one example of how we can use metaheuristics for image processing and computer vision applications. We can look at various other techniques. So here just very briefly can show you one on multi-level thresholding. So kind of a related technique where we are interested in finding a set of thresholds for an image, for a grayscale image, so that we can represent that image afterwards with those thresholds. That's also can be used either directly for segmenting images or as a precursor for segmentation algorithms. So here again, what we're after is essentially a set of thresholds. And again, we're trying to find the best set of thresholds, and we can use metaheuristics for that purpose. So again, we need to define an objective function. So one possibility would be doing something similar to what we've done before in terms of color quantization. So, something that basically calculates the error between the original image and the thresholded image. So here we're doing something slightly differently. Here we're actually doing something that's based on the entropy of the thresholded image. So an alternative fitness function that kind of highlights that, we're not restricted in terms of the fitness function that we can use. If we see color quantization as a clustering problem, that means we can use clustering algorithms. But clustering algorithms are typically based on the means, they basically minimize the mean squared error. Using metaheuristics, we can actually do much more. We can use different fitness functions as well, rather one that actually comes with a particular algorithm. So this is why here I've actually picked a different fitness function and one that's here based on the entropy. So we're trying to find a set of thresholds that allows us to maximize the entropy of the thresholded image. Again, I'll show you a couple of examples. So here are, again, a set of standard images that we're using for evaluation, and also for each one you see the histogram. And you can see that they're all different kinds of histograms, because we want to see that the algorithm works for different situations. And on the next slide, okay, so that's probably not really a slide to study, or at least not to study here. But that shows you on the left-hand side the results that we're getting. So these are the results on the images in terms of the objective function, in terms of the fitness function. And again, so here we've used SOMA, the SOMA algorithm that's in the last column. And here we've actually compared SOMA to something like 10 other metaheuristics. So here we have DE, that's differential evolution, PSO is particle swarm optimization, FF is Firefly algorithm, CS is Kaku search, and a couple of other ones, more recent ones. So we're basically interested in using SOMA and also seeing how well it performs against other techniques. And the results were quite nice. They actually showed us that SOMA works really, really well on that particular problem. So we see most of the results in the last column are bolded. That means that's the best result. And on the right-hand side, you see a kind of a ranking analysis. So for each of the algorithms, you see the rank of that particular algorithm. So we see it's mostly ones for SOMA. That means it's mostly the best algorithm. And then you see the different ranks for the other ones. And then we can average things as well. And we get almost 1 basically here for SOMA, which means it clearly outperforms all the other techniques quite nicely on that particular problem and on those particular images. And we've also played around with different numbers or thresholds. One of the other things that we're interested here is actually not picking like a low number of thresholds as most of the previous work has done, but actually picking higher number of thresholds like 10, 15, 20. That also means that here we've got a search space which is much, much, much larger than what was investigated before. And here we can also see that SOMA actually does really well in that, quite high dimensional optimization problems. And the last slide here is again, this showing you some examples, basically what we're getting. So this is the original image. That's actually an image that comes from the Berkeley segmentation data set. So there's some ground truth as well that was manually segmented by subjects. And then here we see the different results from the different algorithms. And again, it's not so easy to actually see differences here, but if you look closely, you see that, the kind of SOMA one gives us the one where the kind of areas are best delineated, so best segmented when we're looking both at the original image and at the various ground truth segmentations as well. Right, so I've run over in terms of time, so let me just very quickly summarize. So if we're looking at using metaheuristics, kind of generic algorithms for some, we don't have that much time, so for some image processing applications. So I have briefly introduced 3 different kinds of metaheuristics that were developed by my colleagues. So a variant of simulated annealing, then SOMA, self-organizing migration algorithm, and human mental search. And I've mainly focused on the problem of color quantization, and then very briefly also looked at multi-level thresholding. So I've shown you that those techniques work really well. We get excellent results. We also get excellent results compared to both dedicated techniques, also compared to clustering techniques for color quantization, and also actually compared to other metaheuristics, as I've shown you briefly for the thresholding example. There's lots of other things that can be done, which basically don't have time for here. So we can use, kind of alluded to that, we can use different fitness functions, more complex fitness functions, for example, for color quantization, better image quality metrics. And we've done some work on that before. We can kind of improve the metaheuristics by incorporating a local search, for example. That can be something that's quite simple, like running k-means after we're running one of the metaheuristics, because k-means will identify, it's guaranteed to identify the local minimum. But it can also be something that's more complex. And on both of these, we have done some work. And we can also do things like automatic image clustering. So something where we're interested in identifying not just the configuration of the cluster centers, but also the number of clusters. Because for a typical image, we don't know how many objects there are in the image. So we don't know how many clusters we need to derive. And again, fairly recently, we've done some work and published some work in that area. But unfortunately, I'm way over time, so my apologies for that, for cutting down a little bit the time for questions. So I will stop at this point, and if there are any questions, I will be happy to try to answer those. So thank you for listening and for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Professor Gerald, for this wonderful presentation. It's really interesting. I think we have 10 questions for this presentation. Let's start by the first one.
Okay.
Thanks on how we choose the appropriate metaheuristic and what are the used metrics to judge the convergence and the quality of the found solution in these type of problems.
Right. So first of all, in terms of what is the right metaheuristic, what is the right algorithm? So as I've mentioned at the beginning, there is this no free lunch theorem. So that basically says there is no right algorithm for everything. And in a sense that says, well, you should be trying out a couple, So there's also where a lot of our motivation comes from in terms of actually developing those metaheuristics. A lot of work has been done. That doesn't mean one can do even more work, and there's continuously people coming up with new techniques, including some of those that I've mentioned, and there's always room for improvement. There's room for improvement both in terms of trying to find better heuristics or heuristics that might work better for particular problems. So the ones that we've tested, they work really well on the kind of problems that I've mentioned, and they also outperform a lot of the other techniques, previously developed techniques, on, for example, on that multi-level thresholding, or on image clustering and so on as well. What was the second part of the question? You were asking something related to convergence, or?
About the convergence and the quality of the found solution in this type of problems.
Right. So I didn't show you any conversion plots in the talk. But here again, so it's important that we've got, what I mentioned before, these two different goals. So we've got on the one hand the goal of exploration, so exploring the search space, and then exploitation, trying to find the best solution within a particular area of the search space. And that also is reflected in the kind of typical convergence plots that we are getting. If we have done some work, again, mainly on that multi-level thresholding, where we've looked, for example, at that human mental search, so that technique developed by my colleague in Iran. And we've also compared it again to something like 10 or 15 other metaheuristics. And what was nice there was that we got better results in terms of, again, either peak signal to noise ratio or entropy. And the other thing that was quite nice is that we could also show that actually HMS, or human mental search, was actually converging faster as well compared to the other techniques here. So that means we can, in a sense, if you want, we can stop the algorithm earlier and still get a really good solution. We did compare them by, each algorithm was run for the same number of functional evaluations, which is the typical things that you do for comparing those.
Second question by Qassas Ibrahim. So very interesting presentation. Thanks, Professor Gerald. If I understand, metaheuristic optimization for color quantization is equivalent for segmentation or clustering to region with close color with less number of clusters.
So can you repeat the second part? So it's like color quantization is equivalent. I didn't quite catch that.
Is equivalent for segmentation or clustering to region with close color with less number of clusters.
So color quantization, as I've mentioned, can be formulated as a clustering problem. And clustering can be used for segmentation. So, one of the simplest techniques to perform segmentation is to do clustering. So yes, it can be used. It's not the only application of color quantization. And similarly, that multi-level thresholding, that can also be used for segmentation or as a pre-processing technique for segmentation.
The third question given by Fatma Shillali: are metaheuristic algorithms such as SOMA efficient for any type of images, like the presence of human with complex background?
Well, again, in a sense, like with many of these, one would need to try it out. So we have, for thresholding. So here you see the images that we've used. And here you see that, that includes images with people in there, that includes, images which are, kind of more stylistic and so on, images with animals. And for that particular problem, at least, we got really good results for all the tested images. that doesn't mean it will work on, any image, as again mentioned before, for some images, other techniques will work, probably a little bit better. But at least on average, and for the vast majority of the images that we've tried, so SOMA here gave, really good results.
Fatima Shilali, you can speak?
Yes.
Okay.
Good morning for everyone.
Yeah, hi.
Okay.
Yes, it's okay for the answer of Professor Gerald.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, because sometimes we treat some images with complex background, in particular for human, for deaf people who use a lot gesture communication. So for segmentation of the hand, of the physical part, it's important for our research. This is why I ask you about the efficiency of the algorithm for this type of images.
Right. I mean, it does depend also on the applications, and and of course on what images you've got. I mean, there's one thing there's to say. So the stuff that I've introduced here, so both color quantization and the multi-level thresholding, so everything here is essentially it's based on, or it's on a pixel basis in a sense. So if we're doing segmentation here, the segmentation would be done purely based on the pixel value. It's not taking into account, the neighboring pixels, and in particular for segmentation, that's often quite important. So that's so I'm not saying that this is the best thing you can do for segmentation. So here we are purely looking at how well does it actually do for thresholding, and threshold can be used for segmentation, but it's not the best approach for all methods. There's also the other things that can be done in terms of thresholding. So there's like two-dimensional thresholding where you actually take into account neighboring pixels and so on as well. We have started looking at that and also starting looking at using Metaheuristics, but we haven't published anything yet. So that will be one step basically going towards actually getting better segmentation results. But if you're purely interested in segmentation, and there are other techniques as well. There are techniques that are based like on edges and so on. There are of course nowadays lots of techniques that are deep learning, and they might well work better for particular situations, for particular images. Thresholding has got the advantage that it's very, very simple. So once you have actually identified the thresholds, it's very fast and there's not much more to do. Whereas a lot of the other segmentation techniques are basically much more involved. So there's always a trade-off, what you're after basically, and what you expect basically from an algorithm.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Gerald, for the quality of your presentation. I have a question about the technical realization of your approach.
Okay.
After the experiments, can you give us a comparison of the response time between your approach and the others? In fact, I would like to know if your method works well in real-time applications.
Okay.
Second question.
Yeah.
Second question. I would like to know if we can use your method as a first step of object recognition inside an image. Third question. Does your approach work well with interlaced objects?
Right. Okay. So let me try to go through those one by one. So the first one, so this is probably the most common criticism in a sense of metaheuristics, or generally of optimization techniques. They're not really for real-time applications. They take, because you're searching in search space, especially when you're running it population-based, and you need to do that for a certain number of iterations to basically get to sufficiently good results. So here we don't have something that that works real time or even that works in seconds. It's more like minutes, or depending on the problem potentially even hours, you know, if you've got a very complex problem. So no, this is not something that you can use for real-time applications. The second question, the third question was on interlaced. What exactly do you mean is interlaced here? It's like from videos or?
Images, objects.
Yeah, what do you mean with interlaced?
That means that if you have two objects, one object inside the other.
Ah, okay. So not
interfered objects.
Okay, it's not interlaced as in terms of video signals and so on. Yes, I mean it's if you're looking at it from, you know, the main application that I was mentioning was color quantization. So there doesn't really matter what you've got there. You know, you're looking for the best possible representation using a small subset. If you're looking at again, you know, towards segmentation, then things become trickier. And again, as I've mentioned before, you know, in the reply to the previous person who was asking a question, those might not necessarily be the best approaches for doing segmentation. They work for some types of images. And in that case, you know, if there's one object inside the other one, probably doesn't, you know, matter too much as long as they are, you know, distinguishable. But particular for things like, you know, if they're like textured surfaces and so on, they are not going to work that well because they in a sense, they don't know about texture or things like that. I can't quite recall what was the second question, the question in the middle.
Some question. No, I would like if we can use your approach as the first step of image object recognition.
Well, it would depend on what comes after, but I've kind of alluded to that in the introduction. So when color quantization can be used as a first step for subsequent techniques. So we have used it as like a precursor for segmentation. We've also used it as a pre-processing step for object recognition. There's also something very interesting that we did some time ago, where we were looking at content-based image retrieval. And you might know that content-based image is quite often based on color, and quite often based on things like color histograms and so on, or at least that was what people did a certain couple of years ago. One can also actually use color quantization to extract useful color features. So if you run color quantization on image, you can actually use that color palette that you're getting as a feature for image retrieval. And image retrieval, in a sense, is one version of object recognition. So we have done that, and that worked quite nicely, and it would give you like a nice alternative, and also a much more compact alternative to things like color histograms and so on.
The last question for this talk. How do you? Okay, go ahead.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank you, Professor Gerald, for your presentation. That was very interesting. Mm-hmm. And I have a question to answer you about that. Is there a reason of your choice based on the use of 3D images, computer graphics like a teapot, I have said in some of your experiment results, instead of 2D images, which is real images? In some of your like page 15, I think, or I said some computer graphics instead of 2D images. Is there any reasons of your choice?
Right. I mean, so it's because I mean, I've been mainly working on 2D images. So I've been working for many years on computer vision, image analysis, image processing. I've done very, very little work on 3D data, on 3D images. There's some like medical imaging where you get like, slices and so on, like MRI and so on, but I've not done much. Now, in terms of using, optimization techniques, using metaheuristics, if you can define a problem, you can also use it on 3D data. So if you're looking at, again, the kind of segmentation angle, and we want to segment not an image, but we want to segment a volume, then we would be doing that in a very similar way as I've shown you. So we can do some kind of multi-level thresholding on volume data as well. So that's certainly possible. The one thing that one obviously needs to bear in mind here is that that volume data, 3D data, obviously is quite a big, or is quite a bit larger than images. And again, it then comes down to the kind of runtime of those algorithms, which even for the kind of images that I've shown you is generally significant, at least compared to other methods. And if you're then adding another dimension basically to that problem, it will then obviously also take longer to basically get to that stage where you get good solutions. But in principle, yes, you can use those techniques on volume data. You can use it for computer graphics problems, as long as you can define those in terms of an objective function or a fitness function. There are lots of possibilities here.
Okay, I think we can close this session. We thank once again our speaker, Professor Gerald Schaefer.
Thank you very much for the invitation again.